Hey, my name is Dawson and I love flipping pieces of furniture, but sometimes these projects really give me a run for my money, and this dresser was one of my toughest projects yet. I got this dresser at a Habitat for Humanity restore for $30, and it is in rough shape, but I bought it because it has really clean lines and could easily be modernized. The paint was in pretty rough shape. It had this weird marble effect to it, and it was chipping off in a lot of places, which I had to take the paint all the way off to paint it. I wanted to maybe move these handles into the middle of the drawers to be a little bit bigger, and then the bottom was really curvy and a little bit outdated, so I thought I could clean that up and modernize that a bit as well. I started by flipping this dresser over and I actually found a wasp nest under there, which was a little unsettling, but I took this piece of trim off so I could sand a little bit easier and start brainstorming a new base to the project. To help me get that paint off, I used citrus strip. I had this left over from another project, so I tried to stretch it and make it work as best as I could, but you really do want to apply this paint stripper with a thick layer, way more thick than I'm using here as shown. But you put it on and let it sit overnight. It helps if you also put a layer of plastic wrap over it, and this just helps the citrus strip not dry out while you're waiting, and I think it helps it be just a little bit more effective. I had a really hard time actually peeling off the plastic layer when it was time to strip the paint. I have never had this problem before, but it really got stuck onto the dresser, so hopefully this doesn't happen with your project. But I used a little multi-tool to actually go ahead and scrape those paint layers off. This is so satisfying to watch and to do, but it is a little sticky and messy, so I do suggest wearing some gloves. And again, the thicker you put this on, the better it will work. I put a thick layer on the top of this dresser, but on some other parts I did run out of the citrus strip and I had to come back with another paint stripper, which I'll show you in a second. But this is really helpful to get the first layer of paint off so that I wasn't going to have to sand this for a million years. I just was trying to use up all the citrus strip that I had left over from another project. And again, you do want to put a very thick coat on, but as you can see, I kind of started to run out of the citrus strip as I was going. So some sections did not really strip off all the way. So I had to kind of brainstorm and come up with another solution. And I tried out another paint stripper, which a lot of people have recommended to me, and it is the Clean Strip Premium Stripper. This is a little less environmentally friendly. It has harsher chemicals, but it does work in only 15 minutes. It's clear. You use a brush to, again, put a thick layer and brush it all over your piece, and then wait 15 minutes, check a little section to see if it's ready to strip. And when it is, it just slides off the paint. It is so stinking satisfying to do. But I will say, it has really harsh fumes, so you want to make sure you're doing this in a well-ventilated garage or outside, just so that you're not harming yourself, basically. This first pass of the clean strip took off, honestly, like 90% of the rest of the paint, and then I did come back and do a second coat on some of the more tough sections, and here is what it looked like, all stripped off. This is way easier to sand than if I had just left all the paint on. After getting all of that paint off, I switched gears into kind of reconstructing the bottom of this dresser. I used my 5-inch circular saw to cut the sides of the dresser down so that it was completely flush with that section under the drawers. Okay, now I will own up to this mistake. I accidentally broke part of the dresser when I was taking off that original piece of trim. So I had to come back here with some wood glue and clamps to fix this all. Wood glue is super strong. It's stronger than screws and nails. And all you have to do is just put it in that crack or whatever you're trying to fix and then clamp it up for about 30 minutes. And it should be good to go. It will get harder over the next day or so, but after 30 minutes, this was totally fine for me to take off the clamps and keep working on the piece. The top of this dresser has a slight little overhang, and I thought that would be nice to match visually on the bottom of the dresser as well. I used a couple 1x3 pine boards and cut them down to size, and then a combination of wood glue and brad nails to hold it in place. The wood glue is super strong, and that's really what's going to be keeping the boards on here, but the nails will just hold everything in place while it's drying. I'll also be able to use this trim as a place to attach the new legs to. As it is with most pieces that you get online or at a thrift store, there's usually some dings or trips or cracks in the piece, and usually I fill those in with wood filler, but there was a pretty big chunk missing off of the top of the dresser, and I used a Bondo wood filler to fill this up. It's a little bit stronger than a normal wood filler, and it has two parts. You mix the wood filler with a little bit of hardener, and it sets up in 30 minutes, and then you can actually sand it just like wood to kind of build up that shape that you want. I also use this to fill the old screw holes so that I can move the handles to a new location. The last thing I needed to do to prep this piece was sand it with 120 grit sandpaper. I went over the whole thing, and especially on those areas where I put Bondo, just to make sure it was super smooth and ready to be primed. For the primer, I used Bin Shellac Primer. This is really helpful if you're painting something like an IKEA furniture because it will really stick to those slick surfaces, but it also does a really great job on raw wood to make sure that you have no bleed through in your paint. And bleed through is when you have tannins or other things in the wood that are so strong they show through your final paint. So you want to make sure you're using a really good primer so that does not happen to you. And this is my favorite one. I will link it in the description below. The main reason I wanted to do this project was to practice using a paint sprayer, and I had this cool little tent that you set up to paint spray in so that it doesn't fly around your garage, but unfortunately it broke, so I turned that into a tarp for the ground and kind of made my own little makeshift painting studio here in the corner of the garage. I'm still not super confident using a paint sprayer, but that's exactly why I wanted to try this project. Furniture flips are a great place to practice your skills that you're not really sure of yet. So I used my Graco TC Pro paint sprayer and the color Classic Bronze from Behr, and I really like this color, and the paint turned out pretty good. I put this on the lowest setting possible, and I did find out later that my spray tip was heavy duty, which is not what I want for a furniture flip, so I'm going to try the fine tip when I do my next furniture flip. But here's what it looked like after the first coat. I think it really came out pretty good. No drips or anything like that, but there was a few spots that didn't get as much paint, so I did have to come back for a second coat. In between the first and second coat, I did a really light sand with 220 grit sandpaper and made sure to get all of that sawdust off with a tack cloth before I did my next coat. I decided to leave the drawers in when I was painting, and then there was a few sections that I had to come back later and touch up with the paintbrush, but this was really fast and saved me a lot of time having to tape off things that I didn't want to get painted inside of the dresser because the drawers were there covering it up. I did go ahead and let everything dry overnight because I wanted it to be super dry before I decided to spray the poly on it. And this is where things really started to go downhill. First of all, I spilled the poly all over the place when I was trying to get it ready. And then once I started spraying it, the battery died in my sprayer, which left a bunch of awkward drips in it that didn't really come out in the end. And I also had the sprayer on way too high of a setting. It was on 5 out of 10, which meant it was spraying way more poly than I needed, which in the beginning I couldn't really tell that was a problem because it looked fine, but eventually it all started dripping and I had to get out my paintbrush and eventually a little roller to try to fix all these drips. And poly is something that you really do not want to try to overbrush because once it starts drying, if you come back and touch it again, it will show the brush marks or the roller marks. And I did kind of end up with a slightly textured finish because of this. It doesn't look horrible, but it's really not what I was hoping for when I decided to spray the poly on this thing. So I'm definitely learned a lesson about this. And I'll have to make some changes next time I do it. But again, this is why I like practicing on pieces of furniture, because I'd rather learn this mistake here than if I was trying to do this project somewhere in my house. I also was using a satin finish, and I'm wondering if a flat finish would be better, but let me know in the comments if you have experience using poly in a sprayer. A couple of the drawers were actually broken on this dresser. There is a little wooden rail that goes inside of the dresser, and that matches up with a track on the bottom of each drawer. Now, these little wooden rails are easily broken, I guess, in pieces of dressers that I've seen. So I just used a little bit of wood glue, made sure it was in the right spot, and then clamped it down so it could dry. And I did put a couple nails in some of them just to make sure that they were holding, but that was it. It was totally fixed and the drawers work great now. To finish off my modernization of this piece, I wanted to add new legs. It was really easy to install too. I used a drill bit to drill a hole that is the same size as this piece of metal that you screw into the trim. This is the thing that you actually screw your legs into, and it was super easy to do. It took about 1 to 2 minutes for each leg. I did have a little bit of trouble with my hardware. I filled in those old screw holes with Bondo, but it was my first time and I did not know you need to overfill the holes because Bondo will shrink when it's drying. So you can still see where the old screw holes were, and instead of trying to do that whole filling process again and repainting, I just decided to scrap the plan of one big handle for each drawer and repunch those old screw holes and just put in a couple smaller handles. This was ultimately way easier for me than trying to repaint and redo this whole thing, and I think it actually looks pretty good in the end. Here's a quick refresher of what this piece looked like when I started, and here it is now. This dresser really gave me a run for my money, but I like the way it turned out, and I'm excited that I got to learn so much about how to use a paint sprayer, best tips and tricks when you're spraying poly, and what not to do when you're filling in handle holes. All in all, I think it turned out pretty good, but let me know what you think in the comments, and make sure you subscribe for more furniture flips and home DIY projects.